So one of the things I've done since the last clip was I had to spend quite a lot of time fixing this gearbox. The customer is using a used gear drive set until the new or until the restock and the Type 2 version comes out. And basically the small plate that was in there that I mentioned before wasn't flat and had lots of burrs and stuff on, and basically this idler gear in the middle wasn't sitting correctly. So it took me quite a lot of time to fix that and get it working. But now it's, as you can see, it's nice and smooth. So since then I've also put on the rear lower brace, the rear upper braces. These two parts are massively underrated. They really tie in. Basically, if you can have the rear aluminium bulkhead, the rear aluminium upper brace and the lower brace, this whole rear end is so stiff, and it's all the one place on the chassis that adding weight isn't such a problem. It's over the rear axle. It's, you know, it's the rear axle is here. It's basically as far back as you can get it without going behind the axle. So it's not a bad place, but it just means that you get real direct transfer of power from the motor, and the whole rear suspension is really rigid and predictable, basically. So this is my preferred setup. Black motor mount here, which is obviously not as pretty as the rest of the chassis. The 10th anniversary GALM includes the floating motor mount in red, but at the moment I'm not running the floating motor mount for the simple reason that I've run it since it launched, and recently, earlier this year, I decided to take it off the chassis for a little while and just see how it was without it, because it's been so long of running it, and I've just been enjoying having a bit less weight over the rear, and so it's like that for now. And then very, very soon we've got the high motor mount coming and the rear motor mount coming, so I'm going to be playing with those next. But unfortunately, they don't, with the 10th anniversary GALM, they didn't really intend for you to use this part, even though it's included, because 99% of people went straight to the floating motor mount that's included as well. I've also built the front bulkhead ready to go on. It's really important that you make this part square, so you can see everything lines up beautifully. There's no twist. It's very hard to get wrong, but I have seen people do it. So that part's ready to go on. I've also put the ball studs in ready for the upper arms. The manual tells you to put some spacers in there, and that's a good place to start. Currently I'm not running them, but it does mean these threads protrude a little bit underneath, and when you're running the steering setup that I'm running, you need to make sure that the ball end clears that, otherwise you're going to end up with it binding. So yeah, it's just a little bit of tweaking when you get to that point, but I'll maybe talk about that a bit later on. The Transwane chassis is really cool because you can build the rear end like this, and then it just inserts, and you can set your wheelbase like this. Using the screws here. I think that's the standard position if I remember right, the middle one, and then so you can go forward for shorter wheelbase or rear for longer wheelbase, and then you can do the same with the battery mounts as well. So I'm now at the point where I need to put some suspension mounts on, but I just thought I'd show a couple of greases that I use. I generally just use silicone grease for ball diffs, black grease for drive shafts, and rust plates on the screw on the ball diff. I use this Tamiya Serra grease, which is part number, or it's 87099. Not sure if that's going to show. Basically, the only place I use that on any cars is where there's metal on metal rotating contact. So here, I use it between these two gears only. This bottom gear is a plastic gear, so these two gears are metal. And what you want to do with it is put it on before you're going to drive, because it will just flick off. So you put it on, let it dry. And it just keeps these two gears from eating each other. It works really well, actually. I was recommended it when I was in Japan. I picked some up, which is still this tube, and I've barely used any. I mean, that's about 4 years worth of use. So I'm not going to do it right now because I'm going to be handling these parts, but before I give the chassis to its owner, I'll give it a couple of coats, maybe 12 hours apart or something like that, and these two gears then just don't wear. So that's well worth having. And then I use this the Tamiya Moly grease. This one is, it's 87022, and this one I just use on suspension mounts. You can use it in place of black grease, but this one is a bit harder for me to source over here in the UK, so I use it as sparingly as possible. And I'm going to just put a bit on a piece of plastic bag, not loads. You don't need a lot of this stuff at all, and all I do is I put this inside the suspension mount for the suspension ball, and I just get a Q-tip or a cotton bud, depending on where you're from, what you call it. So I just take it like that, feed it in, swirl it around, and you've got a decent amount in there, and then I just take a clean end and wipe off the excess. So I'm just using a very, very, very small amount in each one. And obviously you do this you need to make sure you clean it up, because otherwise it's going to just attract dirt. And so basically I just put that in, and all that does is that just makes the contact between the suspension ball and the suspension mount smoother. So it's well worth doing. It's worth taking the extra 30 seconds to do it when you're building it. And it's something you need to regularly maintain, but it's not something that you have to do as often as you'd think. Basically, if I'm rebuilding my dampers, it's probably a good time to do this. But I'm doing all 4 now, just because then I can put the grease away and crack on. And I'm running, incidentally on this, I'll be running the TC mounts front and rear. So I'm not using the TC mounts on the rear of my car at the moment, but only because I have a non-overdose diff in the back that makes it a little bit complicated to get set up right. The TC mounts are what I prefer to run, and I'm going to put them back on very shortly when I make the change to the high motor conversion on my chassis. Because the rear easy setup arms are very short, you need a wider suspension mount than normal to make them work well. And the TC mounts give extra traction, and they're basically the go-to absolute must-have for me. So I'm just going to start with the rear suspension mounts and the suspension arms, and you can see here that I'm using the easy setting short arms. I think these are 46mm pin to pin, so they are very short. There are shorter on the market, but these work really well and they're designed for a GALM. So let's just compare the weight of the standard arm with the damper mount installed, which is 9.65. That's with 2 stainless 8mm screws. This part is obviously separate on this arm, so you actually have to screw it in. And now let's compare it with the ES arm. So then there's the weight of an ES arm. It's 10.8. Basically, by using these, you can get a lot of camber change that you can utilise for extra traction. So one thing that's different with Overdose to other manufacturers is all Overdose suspension arms are designed to be tight to the pin. So this scrub screw is used to lock it to the suspension pin, and then the pivot ball that goes into the suspension mount is actually where the movement happens. So that's one of the reasons I add the grease, is just to make that as smooth as possible. A lot of other manufacturers don't do that. They do it the other way around, where the arm slides on a pin. So you'll see some people will be reaming out an Overdose arm, and that's just the worst thing you can do. You want to keep the pin as tight on the arm as possible, so these two move together. So that's one unit, and then the pivot ball on the end is different. These 2 mil spaces on each side of the arm to keep it centered. And what I basically do is I just stand the arm on its end so that they're all together, and then I tighten up this grub screw. So then that is one tight unit. Same deal, stand it on its end, just nip up the grub screw, and that way you know that the pin is flush on the bottom and on the top. So the rear I'll use the 8mm screws so that I can add a 2mm spacer without having to worry about it. There we go. Then I put the arm in, do the other arm, and then this other suspension mount can come in from the front very easily, if I can see things better. And then I'll use the 2 6mm for that. If you really want to get crazy, you can go with lightweight screws and things like that, whereas for me, stainless steel is light enough. Titanium screws are lovely, and I do use them on my own chassis, but I think your average person, it's better to just make sure you're using good screws rather than light screws. So this is what I was mentioning before. I just slacken off these 2 screws, and then as I put the front suspension mount on the rear, I will just make sure that everything goes in nicely. And basically when you tighten these screws up, everything needs to move smoothly. So if your arms are binding, then you need to redo this step, maybe adjust your grub screws and things like that. So like this one's fine, this one's too tight. So what I'll do is I will just loosen off that grub screw and then just re-tighten these screws and make sure that they've gone in nice and square. There we go. So now they're both loose. And it's just a case of, you should do that on every chassis, that's not GALM specific. It's just, it's really easy to end up with a tight arm that you don't spot until later down the line. And basically, if you're driving down the road and this arm is behaving differently to this arm, your car's never going to feel good. So you want them to literally both, if you pick up the arms and drop them, you want them to just drop together, and then that's all good. So now that the arms are free moving, you can also see that they don't move forward or back whatsoever, partly because this is a full aluminium build, but also Overdose are very good at making sure that everything is spaced properly and it comes out exactly as it needs to. So literally you can see there was zero movement forward and back, but there's perfect up and down movement.